But I missed Thanksgiving one time, and I told myself that day that I would just
Hi everyone, my name is Paul Cunningham. I'm the Creative Writing Program Coordinator. Unfortunately, Royce Grant couldn't join us tonight. He has fallen ill, so I will be introducing Steve. And Ham's Bookstore is also here tonight with copies of Steve's books available for purchase. And first, I think we should all give ourselves. I'll wait for it. Hi, everyone.
We were locked out. Yeah, we were locked out.
I don't see anyone else coming up the stairs. This is our first reading of the semester. It's very exciting to be back in person. So you want to give yourselves a round of applause. It's better than being on Zoom. Tonight I'm honored to have the privilege of introducing Steve Tomasula, a champion of experimental high-risk writing, a true innovator and an invaluable mentor. Tonight he will be reading from his new novel, Ascension, which is available from the University of Alabama Press. A novel about the end of nature, or rather the end of three natures. The time just before Darwin changed the natural world, the 1980s, just as the digital and genetic revolutions begin to replace nature with environment, and today, a time when we have the ability to manipulate nature at both the scale of the planet and at the genome. The narrative follows three different biologists on the brink of each of these cultural extinctions to explore how nature occupies our imaginations and how our imaginations bring the natural world and our place in it into existence. Joanna Drucker calls Ascension a striking work of combined intellectual and creative force. She writes, Tomasula vividly evident the terrifying reality of our current dystopia as we careen towards disaster, starting with the epigraph, "It did not have to happen this way." Lydia Yuknovich says Tomasula has opened up a lyric, atmospheric experience for readers across time and space, playfully, beautifully, and sometimes frighteningly staged upon the page. Lance Olson notes that Ascension is both a brilliant contemplation of just how wrong we've become, how poorly we've read the text of our planet and ourselves, and a keen exploration into how we represent these unimaginables through our culturally inflected imaginations. Tonight we also have copies of an anthology also available from the University of Alabama Press that Steve edited called Conceptualisms. In it, Tomasula has gathered poems, prose, and hybrid pieces that all challenge our understanding of what literature means. Intended as a collection of the most exciting and bold literary work being made today, Tomasula has put a spotlight on the many possibilities available to writers and readers wishing for a glimpse of literature's future. Steve Tomasula is the author of Once Human, Stories, and the novels In and Oz, The Book of Portraiture, TOC, a new media novel, and Voss, an opera in Flatland. He is the editor of Conceptualisms, the anthology of prose poetry, visual found, and hybrid writing as contemporary art. His essays on literature and art have also appeared widely. He lives in Chicago, and you can read more at www.stevetomasula.com. Let's give it up for Steve Tomasula.
Be back here. I'm really wishing I had read this zombie novel more. It seemed to make a lot more sense somehow. But here we are, and here's the book. And Paul kind of already read my introduction, so I guess I'll just get into it. as Paul said, it's the section of the novel about the end of nature, or three natures. You know, each chapter, there's 3 chapters, and each one takes up a different kind of conception of nature. So the first one is right before Darwin comes onto the stage and changes conception. So, you know, in a way, this idea of what nature is goes extinct 3 different times during the book. But throughout the book, I've tried to use the materials of the time period. For example, this engraving of the land bridge across the Strait of Gibraltar breaking. You know, people thought that the Mediterranean Valley was a valley until the Atlantic Ocean broke this land bridge and flooded it and turned it into the Mediterranean Sea that we know. Or those exquisite 19th century etchings of insects and animals that were scientific drawings but meant to invoke awe. You know, there wasn't this big distinction between art and science that we have now. So, you know, they were very much one and the same. So trying to incorporate that mode of thinking into the novel led to using some of these materials. The second chapter jumps to the 1980s, and this is the time period right when the digital revolution and also the genetic revolution has taken off. And so you can see this kind of, well, and these are 3 satellite pictures. The first one, the black and white one, is 1970, you know, right after the moon landing, basically. And satellite photography is kind of a new thing. And across the 10 years, if you, the last image, the furthest one, 1980 over there, you can see the Paraguayan River, how much it's swollen because they dammed it for a hydroelectric plant. And then, of course, the urban sprawl that's on both sides of it. So, you know, we're starting to get this global view of the world, you know, thinking of Earth as spaceship Earth in a way with limited resources and something that needs to be tended to. And then finally, the last chapter, which I'll read from tonight, is basically the present, where, as Paul said, you know, we're able to manipulate the Earth on both a planetary scale as well as a genetic scale. I'll read from this, and actually the book has, the last chapter of it has two different versions. You know, there's the book itself, the paper copy, but there's also an online version of the 3rd chapter. They're basically the same. It's just that, you know, in the book there's like QR codes and websites and things like that, where, you know, online you just have to click on things. And again, I was trying to, like in the other chapters, integrate sort of the materials of the time as part of the story. And so, you know, doing a story about the present just seemed natural to kind of incorporate this kind of online world that we live in. So, for example, there's an epigram here that's a live picture of Earth from space. And I knew this was going to happen. It's, you know, the satellites over nighttime. All day long, it worked great. So, all right. Okay, this is what it looks like. Imagine what it usually looks like, and I'll just pick it up from here. I don't think there's anything you need to know other than, you know, the story doesn't really follow a plot. It's more of a mosaic of pieces that, as you read, the story begins to emerge out of them. And this section excerpt I'll read today is the characters that come up are Olympia, who's like a principal investigator in a biology lab, and Gabe is like a lab technician in her lab. Dan is an information designer that they're working with. There's also Meadow, who's also a scientist in her lab who's lost a son in a tsunami. And I think the only other thing that you might need to know is that NGOs are referenced throughout this. They're kind of like an Antifa movement for the environment, neon greeners. So You just start reading, and you get to read along. It's projecting, it's like storytelling. When the end came, it came as resolutely as the sun, having as much choice and giving as much warning as a pre-dawn sky, when there was just enough light for an imam to distinguish black from white thread, the alba moment, when the convergence of temperature and pressure morphs dew to fog, and day's first gray warns lovers to part. The strengthening day quickening the rooster's circadian rhythms till its crow erupts and pricks the ears of thieves and betrayers. But few had been awake, not to this end, not the imam, not the lovers in their bed, not the thief in his rounds. Even after Arctic ice began to pool, mirroring the rosy fingers of dawn, lovers sighed and returned to the dream of their embrace. Even as the bottoms of those ice lakes cracked, betrayers denied the dawn thrice, then 4 more times, dismissing as chicken littles the roosters who warned of rising seas. Relentlessly, having no more choice than water over a fall, trickles of ice melt grew into streams. Soon circular Niagara Falls of melting ice were pouring in on themselves, their thunderous torrents creating rivers beneath the ice caps as a current undermines the foundation and causes a seawall to collapse. The Arctic shelves broke apart far faster than anyone had anticipated, and it wasn't until the sun was fully up that people noticed. The seas had in fact risen so much that lowlanders who had been crowing for highlanders to wake to see were migrating from the rising water. Masses of refugees, the bottom billion who once inhabited sea-swept coasts, now moved ever inland, while those nations that remained dry installed fences and cameras and guards and tightened the mesh of their electronic screens, as if that would help when in fact it only made the whole world flat. A monotonous drone was everywhere. Animals that couldn't live everywhere withered. Malaria and poison ivies crept northward with kudzu and tropical insects proliferating in ever higher latitudes. The corrals built around refugees unable to keep out the insects that had begun to migrate upward, bringing with them diseases that had only been known in what had been the low, hot, and humid tropics. Beeping. The alarm on the humidifier that kept acting up went off again, and Gabe hit its reset button as lethargically as she might silence the alarm on her bedside clock. How odd it was to wake to a reality more sci-fi than her daydream. Tired. Always she seemed tired, as though coming down with a cold. The humidifier was blowing normally, according to the gauge on the wall. Paraguayan humidity. No danger to the lice colonies that she tended. She made a mental note to check the alarm's trigger later, a lack of energy making her put off everything, and she returned to the monotony of transferring blood-fed lice into ovipots. As she worked, she tried to slip back into the graphic novel that she drew in her free time, but it was getting harder. Not harder to daydream, just harder to keep pace with banana trees that shed leaves of synthetic skin, mice that chirp, scorpions with the intelligence of rats, and the rest of the genetic mess that the wild was becoming. How strange, after all the disaster films, Planet of the Apes, after the countless books, movies, video games, and scientific studies too, the Club of Rome, after all the denial, there was such an explosion of life, just as the planet was dying. Not dying, still, it was hard to get her mind around the idea of an Earth that all humanity had known becoming a place that none of those old planet people would recognize. NGers got tattoos of red marble Earth, that black and red cartoon meme of Earth boiling off its atmosphere as though it were a meteor. But maybe the best tattoo would be of a cargo ship the size of Kansas traveling from China to America and passing as it did an identical ship traveling from America to China and both loaded with cars. Whatever. The punks just got their tattoos and went back to their barista jobs, and most people didn't even do that much. They just went to work. They had their morning coffee, tucked in their kids at night, worried about house payments, and updated their software. Even the people she worked with here in the lab were more worried about the next outbreak of avian influenza, H5N5. The virus spread like the common cold and characterized by its sudden onset and internal bleeding, rapid contagion, and a mortality rate that can approach 100%. The big one, they call it, The tsunami of bird flus that could make the COVID-19 outbreak with its food shortages and outdoor morgues look like the sniffles. Who wouldn't feel run down given that to think about 24/7? Working in the insectarium all day didn't help. She sighed at the containers of sandflies, the wall of ducks, geese, and other birds in glass containment boxes like feathered fish in aquariums, blue-fronted parrots captured in Paraguay crawling with lice, specimens to generate the data Chen needed for a statistical analysis. Olympia, the PI directing the study, had Gabe blunt the beaks of the parrots so they couldn't preen, allowing their lice populations to shoot up. Some of the birds scratched themselves incessantly, others sat there enduring. The room was sealed as tight as a walk-in refrigerator with industrial-strength doors. The perfect setting for one of those doomsday scenarios where someone emerges from a bank's vault or fireproof storage room to discover that the rest of the world had perished in a nuclear blast or been overrun by zombies. Should she put zombies in her story? Looking toward the listless parrots, she realized that they were already there. Except, instead of the supplies that would stock a real bomb shelter, the wire shelving of her vault had held ovipots of the fleas, lice, and flies that she bred for the labs. Tupperware containers of stage 1 larvae and stage 2 larvae that she fed on the mold that grew on ground-up rabbit feces, nursing them into adulthood. She'd fertilize the disease-carrying adults, let them feed on the geese, and then bear eggs that she'd nurse into stage 1 larvae, trapping her in a cycle that needed constant care, even on holidays. Sauna-like heat and humidity, the mind-numbing drone of the humidifiers and smell, whatever was good for the lice and flies, she, their bitch, had to take. Gabe selected a mouth aspirator and threaded the business end of its rubber hose into the glass box she had filled with lice from the birds. She began to suck. The cage was suddenly a snow globe of bird lice and human shrieks, she imagined, her aspirator the Godzilla to their Tokyo. The lice fled to the white light that their neurobiology equated with escape. It was actually the white cloth that she'd stretched across the back of the cage where their tiny black bodies would stand out, making them easy to catch. If only they could step outside their own story for the God's eye view of what was happening. She was after the females that had taken a blood meal from the birds, their tiny bodies bloated with bird blood as compared to the more elongated males. As she sucked one after another into the tube, she made a mark on a scrap of paper for every 10 she caught. "Another shitty day in paradise," said the postcard taped to the wall, its edges curled. If she used her imagination, its palm trees swayed in a beach breeze instead of the airstream of the humidifier. "Eat it. Wish you were here." It was from Guy. When his unit was called up, he was first sent to Bahrain, which locals claimed was the site of Eden, and he emailed everyone in the lab a postcard. Sunshine, the drone of surf, heat, humidity, beads of sweat running down her back. She could almost imagine the rubber hose she sucked on as a straw in a pina colada if it weren't for the stench of feces, if she didn't feel like the last woman on earth. And this, a man on a TED Talk said, may well end up being the pinnacle of civilization. Whatever. Two geese labored to gain altitude, one rising into place at the wingtip of the other. The pair joined by a third and more, the geese languidly forming a V in the sky. Not because of a leader, but because patterns of behavior could emerge as surely as a convergence of light and moisture could throw a rainbow across the sky. The geese made their way south across a brilliant sunrise, each bird carrying the logic of the flock, and the logic of its lice, and the logic of the cells within the lice, and the logic of the virus within the cells, turning the tumblers on their biological locks. The odds of hitting the jackpot on a penny slot machine were 1 in 1,000. A player pulling the handle 10 times a minute would hit the right combination every 100 minutes. The 1,000 players would produce 10 winners every minute, whether those players were people cycling through combinations on a slot machine or the genetic stuff of a bird. A flu infection can produce 200 trillion new viruses a week. Some combinations would be stymied, freezing into death as quickly as they were born, while others opened up new paths for life, the way a single log in a jam can suddenly click out of place and allow a mighty river to flow within viruses, within lice, within geese, within flocks like these, all over the world, on the move, laboratories in the sky, crossing borders, landing in forests and public parks, and backyards and waterways and wading pools. What was she hiding? Or rather, what was it that made him think she was hiding something? Dan wondered, listening to Olympia talk to his boss. He'd seen it before. Some professor discovers a protein-fold or useful fractal pattern, or some other philosopher's stone able to turn academic research into dollars, and voila, another startup is born. Before the meeting, IIM, Information in Motion, the company that Dan worked for, had Google Serrated her profile, of course. She didn't do FP2 and only checked Join App to avoid flash mobs. But that didn't necessarily mean she was a loner. FP2 had been bleeding users for years. Not that it mattered. Every time she updated any app, they would have downloaded her complete cloud, just as the 75-page privacy notice she probably never read said they would. Facial recognition tagged her galaxy of weddings and birthdays and vacation photos, and the man who used to be in all of her photos until he began showing up in the photos of another woman posed with a different set of kids. Her toothbrush reported as switched on twice a day, 6 a.m. and 10 p.m., and stayed on for an average of 2.3 minutes. Your privacy is our business. It really is. Just as her Fitbit used patterns of wrist movement to determine whether she was on an elevator, sleeping, eating, or driving over the speed limit, IIM extracted patterns from data traces to generate a portrait of her for its sales team. An ex-husband back in California with her son, whose own FB account had tons of info on her. An annual spike in beer, hummus, and paper napkins indicated that she entertained her grad students once each year, the number of beers she bought having a high correlation with the number of grad students enrolled in her lab practice course, and indeed, the locations obtained from their phones showed that they converged at her house once a year, as though her annual party was an obligation, like going to the dentist, which he did twice a year. So this section, if I add a footnote here, this section has links to several sites that track different things. And they're not exactly illustrations of the story per se, so much as illustrations as of the logic underneath the story, underlying the story. So like this one is, you know how your phone, anytime you use your phone, it's constantly pinging microwave towers, and that's how it knows where you're at. You can use Google Maps and all that. So a Green Party candidate got a hold of that data for his phone, and he made an animation of how he's being tracked. So this one is mass shootings in America, which are defined as killings of more than 4 people. This one's a shark tracker. It reminds you of, as Carrie Wolf once said, you know, the large animals in the world track so much now that the squirrels in the backyard are more wild than they are. Yeah, so I'm gonna, you know, I'll read from the book at this point and let this play as kind of a pseudo illustration. The raw data from her car was so regular that its patterns could have been mistaken for those of a rat in a maze. She didn't like cruise control, though there was something going on with her Thursdays. Every third or fourth Thursday, she deviated from her commute by driving to a different high-end restaurant in the tech corridor outside the city. But her charge card history indicated that she never paid for dinner. She started taking these trips about the time that the word cloud we extracted from her email began to change. For the previous 5 years, her engrams had been dominated by work vocabulary. words like parasite, protein, and DNA. Except for that period when she first moved to Chicago. Emails to her then husband bumped up the use of words like miss and you by 19.7%, but took on a slope of -3 as the usage of a part increased. It flatlined after seeing someone else appeared. It was also during this time that her movie watching history skewed towards chick flicks before dropping back to its annual average, 0.67. What kind of person didn't like movies? She began using the gym in her condo with the regularity of a boxer, and her Google searches became even more work intense. Over time, a picture emerged from all the patterns she generated, the way the rings in a tree could tell the story of weather, or so claimed profilers, but anyone who wrote algorithms knew that big D portraits could be so much phrenology, determining moral qualities by reading the bumps in her cloud. Meeting her in the flesh, Dan could see that there was something secret in her life that the data didn't show, or so he liked to imagine, maybe because of her glasses. Clear frames with racy green pinstripes that whispered something not in the profile, or at least a desire for it. Each time she leaned forward to point out something about bird lice, her lab coat stretched and he couldn't help notice a black strap, though the report said she stayed squarely within the quintile that favored beige. That's D-1 on the world map of lingerie use. Okay, let's try the shark tracker here. This guy was pretty active earlier. The last ping was a few hours ago, so okay, maybe we'll get lucky and see the movies as I read. Back in the 80s, she was saying, explaining the background to the project she wanted to bring IIM in on, a biologist in the last remnants of the Paraguayan rainforest noticed what indigenous people had known for centuries. The natives who hunted birds had some immunity to bird-borne diseases. The natives attributed it to the spirit of the birds themselves, but her guess was that it was the lice on the birds, not the birds, that gave hunters immunity. Instead of following up on her speculation, the biologist went down a research dead end about dinosaur feathers and lice. Olympia smiled wistfully. The entomological community can be so competitive, she said, because the stakes are so small. Sorry, it's an old entomology joke. Apologizing for the pun, which was Dan's boss's cue to laugh, louder than the joke was funny, and nodding for Diane to join in. Thinning hair, portly build, his boss was obviously uncomfortable, stuffed into his business suit, more used to lounge seats than the lab stools Olympia had offered him. But there's evidence that her hunch was right, Olympia continued, so that's the first of our goals, to find out which protein in bird lungs saliva gives mammals some protection, if in fact that's what's happening. Our long-range hope is that this knowledge can be used to make a vaccine. For birds or people, Dan's boss asked, taking notes. Both, Olympia said. The answer just came out. But the moment it did, she acted as though she wished she could take it back. She stammered, eventually, I mean. There may be agricultural applications down the road, but right now my lab is looking at antibodies in humans, since that's the mandate given us by our funder, by which she meant the military, Dan, you know. But of course, that's proprietary information, she said. Don't ask, don't tell. She breezed by the moment by going into some of the determinations they have to make, the first being the amount of genetic variability between different bird lice populations. She pulled her chair closer to Dan and pulled up the sleeve of her lab coat, motioning for Dan to lend her his arm. I'm a woman, you're a man, she said, pushing the sleeve of his suit up high enough to expose his forearm. Dan noticed his boss frown at his tattoo, an NG or tattoo of the red marble earth that he always kept covered at work. She laid her arm next to his on the desk. Your hair is coarser than mine, she said, demonstrating. Had she noticed him looking at her and decided to yank his chain? Within the human species, there's a lot of genetic variability. Same with lice. The geese in Venezuela may eat prairie grass, while geese in Bolivia might feed primarily on clover, or even bread thrown to them in urban areas. Their lice will be the same species, but their genetic makeup will have drifted in respect to one another. How much difference is there in their saliva? She pulled his sleeve back down briskly, as though she'd just finished giving a demonstration on a CPR dummy. To determine this, we'll first sequence the genome of the lice from the same species of birds native to different areas. And this graphic is, right now the link is tracking all airplanes in the air, and this one's all the boats. What do you want to see, airplanes or boats?
Boats.
Boats it is. So here's the Mediterranean Valley that is now the Mediterranean Ocean. And let's see, click on a boat, maybe we'll see it move. We should zoom in more. This is all familiar to us, Dan's boss said, unrolling his flex screen on her desk. As he did, the company's demo began to play, introducing info in motion. The demo went through past projects they had completed, city planners tracing fire extinguishers registered to predict where future fire trucks would have to be sent. Another forecast the resources that a hospital would need to treat schizophrenia in 20 years by correlating the number of cats at the Humane Society to the number of playgrounds. Cats in shelters correlate highly to cats in neighborhoods. Cats in neighborhoods use sandboxes and playgrounds. Cat feces and sandboxes carry the T. gondii parasite. Kids exposed to the T. gondii develop schizophrenia in adulthood. In one project for the CDC, IIM had layered data harvested from the cell phones of travelers to show that the Honolulu airport with its connections between the U.S. and Asia would be the world's largest hub for the next pandemic. Dan didn't know the ins and outs of the contract between IIM and the venture capitalists paying for everything, but he bet it involved the use of the cheap stuff, the 1,000 terabytes of census reports, NASA climate data, and the rest of the 900,000 government databases that are always available gratis. They probably link those to databases that the company had amassed on its own in order to magnify their usefulness, the way Google first married a free phone book to a free map, multiplying the power of each, which they then raised to an exponent through software that merged this database with street-level photos, then IP addresses and text messages gathered by trucks taking those street-level photos. It was all multiplied yet again when merged with terabytes of corporate data on everyone who lived at those addresses. The cameras in their laptops tracking their eyes as they skipped over captions or ads. How far people traveled to work, happy hour, or church. Whether they walked, drove, or rode a pogo stick. Who paid for gas at the pump and who paid inside, and so bought cigarettes, and so were higher insurance risks. Who in 5 years could be sold a yacht? Terabytes of data gathered for each and every person, or rather each of these 6.2 billion data nodes, as IIM called them. Life is data, as the promo said. Basically, that's what Darwin did. Look at masses of data points, i.e. the shapes of snails, to discern a pattern, which he called evolution. But this was teaching the software to teach itself to recognize patterns in snails as they morph into other mollusks. The dynamics of open systems, life prediction, like mapping networks of rivets and wells and icebergs and ocean currents, then using it to see the Titanic sink before it pulled away from the pier. From spikes in phone card purchases, the software was able to predict outbreaks of genocide among the bottom billion. Its refugees converting their chickens and goats into phone cards, a form of money for those on the run. Guns, counterfeit watches, slaves, laundered money, refugees, anything in flux, background radiation, city growth, or the night sky. All reality could be seen as flux and patterns, smaller patterns coalescing as larger patterns that form still larger patterns. Workaholic is how the software labeled her personality cluster. Dan's boss chuckled. Kind of ironic how a footnote about dinosaur lice could end up saving millions of people. Olympia just sat there with that tight little smile of hers. Military funding. Or kill them, Dan wanted to say. The vaccine for one side being a gun pointed to the head of the other. What was it like, he wondered, to walk around and skin that tight? Patterns are always made by something, but what? When cameras in space were pointed at the Earth's edge, its atmosphere appeared as thin and transparent as a soap bubble that hadn't popped. At least not yet. Not like the atmosphere of red marble Earth. Still, the black marble that was the Earth at night was dotted by city lights as well as forest fires and flames of burning gas large enough to be seen from space. Hard to believe that smudge of light large enough to cover the East Coast could be the result of individuals oblivious to the monumental patterns they were creating. A mother turning on a bedside lamp to read to her children, a man triggering the light in his garage, a janitor switching on lights in an empty office, a couple in the back of a cab, their faces ghostly in the glow of their phones. Individual actions cluster into systems. Systems, automatic headlights, dusk to dawn street lamps, clusters of systems coalesce into structures, cities at night. Structures shape the behavior of individuals who read to children, emptied waste paper baskets, used phones. During the day, the earth was as blue as a snow globe. When some giant hand shook it to create weather, violent storms could pirouette across its surface, serene and silent from the vantage of the satellites, with thundering down on the millions of creatures beneath them. Watching satellite views of hurricanes reminded Gabe of the prairie she grew up on, a land so flat that her family could watch a rainstorm slide along the horizon as though it were a distant freight train. They used to stand out in the yard and watch tornadoes from afar. The sky would darken as the wind picked up, the fluffy white castles that had drifted by earlier replaced by something closer to the vortex of a hypnotist spiral. Distance reduced sheets of rain to silence, the all-too-real thunder and lightning storming down on people like them they knew, but not them. And she would watch those storms with an odd mix of detachment and dread, like watching a natural disaster on the Weather Channel, except knowing that if the winds twitched, force could add to force to turn the spectacle their way. Watching viruses mutate was a lot like that, she thought, moving her mouse to wake up her computer and activate her world flu radar map. The last pandemic had burned itself out. The whole evolutionary trees of viruses are still out there, still mutating within bats, rabbits, birds, cooking up new versions of Ebola, SARS, Marburg, and Nipah, and would reemerge when, not if, the mutations combine in ways that would let one live in a nasal passage here or on a doorknob there. Health officials still warn local governments to keep their populations vigilant for dead birds, but of course, once people stop dying, no one bothered. Hindsight. A tiny boy bobbing up and down in the ocean and attached to a tsunami beacon could have prevented 300,000 deaths 7,000 miles away in Indonesia. And I think I'll end there.
Steve, if anybody has any questions for Steve?
What did the planning look like this novel? I mean, structurally, it's so unique.
How much time do you have? It's like embarrassing to say, but going back when it was finally going into production, I had files and drafts that were over 10 years old. And I don't, for me, writing is kind of a way of thinking. So I don't really start to think of it as an object until I get down to that, and, to thinking of it as a book. And I had a contract for the book, and the book was supposed to be, like I don't know, giving me like a 400-page limit on it. And the thing was that, I sat down and actually put it together. I realized it's like 800 pages. So I don't know how many years I spent like writing 800 pages and another number of years cutting half of it. I got into the weeds with a lot of these things. Like, when I started this book, and the Anthropocene wasn't even like a word, really. I mean, it was kind of being kicked around, but it wasn't in general parlance. And same thing with feathers on birds. That was kind of a controversial thing at the time too. And I got into the weeds with reading about bird life. So the thing that actually kicked off the book was Robert Traub was this flea expert that worked with Miriam Rothschild. And from looking at the anatomy of fleas, he was able to discern that the only way they could evolve that way is if the continents had all been one at one time. And this was back before Pangea and all this, and it sounded kind of crazy talk, but the idea of looking at these tiny bodies and being to extrapolate these large feces narratives really just kind of like lit my fire for some reason. And so I started reading a lot about fleas. And there's almost no fossils. They just don't fossilize. And so, I read all this stuff, and there's gaps in millions of years, and I do what a writer does, I filled in the gaps. And I didn't have any data. I was just making up a story based on what other people had seen. But the thing was, when I put my evolutionary chart for feather lice on top of dinosaurs, they matched like a hand and glove. And the only way that could happen is if these dinosaurs had feathers, because lice and fleas are very specific to a particular animal. In fact, if you give an entomologist a flea, they can tell you usually not even just what bird it came off of, but what part of the bird. Because the lice that live at the back of the head are different from the ones that live in the wing and so forth. Anyway, so that was like 2 years up in smoke. I forgot what your question was. But so basically it was trying to get all this to coalesce into a novel, and I found myself in this situation where to kind of get the jokes and the puns and all that, you have to sort of know the science, but knowing the science, including the science, just killed the story, and so it was a real kind of struggle to try to reconcile those. And I won't get into it. There's a chapter that has a huge flaw in it that I left in intentionally because I would have to cut out this whole thing that started me writing the novel. So.
Steve, how wedded are you to the idea of novel to describe this work?
Yeah, I never liked that word to begin with. The only thing I come back to in terms of the novel is it's this form that's baggy enough where you can put anything in it. And I much prefer narrative, I guess, as a term. I'm wondering what's motivating your question.
Well, because you were talking about the story. And in all of your writing, I always wonder, like, how much is the information the story and how much is what happens to sort of incidental characters who happen to kind of wander in and out. how much is their story important?
That's a good question. It's something I think about a lot, actually, because stories are kind of another word that I don't use myself. But I guess the short answer would be, like, I kind of don't make any distinction between those. The same thing with the materials at the time. But when I was writing fast, for example, I was reading a lot of stuff about eugenics, and there was I stumbled across a manual that was talking about how to measure a skull. Because in the 1800s, they thought if you measured skull volume, you could determine intelligence from that. And this drawing of how to actually do it, just seems so concrete and so real instead of this kind of abstraction of people doing it, that it just seemed like it had to be part of the story. So I included that as part of the material at the time, but I juxtaposed it with a computer scan sheet from like the 80s again, because if you remember back then, coming up with a number for IQ and using a computer to do it was not like kind of quackery like we might think of now, but cutting edge science. And so, you put any three things in a row and you've created a plot, so juxtaposing that volume of the skull being measured with a computer scan sheet, you open the book and there's a spread there, I hope generates this third thing about what intelligence is, and a lot of times we have better tools, but not necessarily better philosophy.
It just struck me in sort of watching this and knowing your work for a while, like, what's your thinking about sort of the relationship between like permanence of the book and the ephemeral of the book, right? Like that there's some of this that's not future-proof because at some point these data systems will be supplanted by new interfaces and this will be lost. So how do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's like the only reliable memory is to carve it into stone, That's the thing that doesn't even update, because it won't deteriorate, or it will deteriorate slower. And you're right, the electronic stuff is the most ephemeral of all. You miss one update, it's gone. And so, the book is a medium, and I'm very invested in the book, and I think it's a great medium. We don't really think of that. It has a lot to offer, and one of them is this kind of permanence. And plus, publishers want to have something to sell too. So that's I guess. The experience of reading and the materials of the book, and I'm always very conscious of the book. I know a lot of people try to write novels as if they're dreams you can get lost in, and I never been that type of author. I always want to make the book part of the story, I always want to call attention to the fact that a reader is reading something that somebody made up, constructed. It's as much a artifact of its time and place as the story being told. And so for me, that's always been part of the story. And I've always kind of paid a lot of attention to the book itself and the materials of it. It's kind of
Steve, you've always had such fruitful collaborations. Did you do collaborations here? Were you working with any scientists on campus or elsewhere?
Oh, yeah. Oh, as far as, that was another years of my misspent youth, I guess. I think when you write a novel, you kind of wear different hats, and one of them is being a journalist, a researcher. And so I spent a lot of time in biology labs with this, and vase also. I intended just to kind of like be a fly on the wall, but these places, I don't know, how about you? I had this idea that they're much more kind of serious work environments, but they're much more like an artist studio or something like that. So, I'm there just trying to watch what other people are doing, and they're like, oh, can you put your finger on this pig's vein just for a second? So, things like that. So, I got good at sewing up rats. They were doing this study where they're trying to genetically grow a vein around like a blocked artery, and so they would, instead of waiting for the rat to have a stroke, they would put a stitch in the vein to like block the artery and try to grow this vein around it. So, but yeah, I guess. I thought you were going to talk about the designers. Yeah.
That too.
Yeah. I worked with. I realized to do the kind of books that I wanted to write, you'd have to be a Renaissance person, how to manipulate images, and I'm not that person, so I've always worked with collaborators as far as making the book, trying to get the family together and make a book. So I worked with another pastor actually as a graphic designer with this book.
So I'm curious, how did you choose the 3 chapters for your book? Those eras are so specific, and I'm just curious, was it like choosing a favorite child, having only picked 3? Like, how was that experience?
That's a good question. Basically, I was thinking of the book in terms of extinction, and for me those were kind of 3 watershed moments. Because before Darwin, it was natural philosophy. There was natural historians who were very much philosophers, and they were trying, not everybody, but for the most part, they're trying to reconcile what they were finding in the geological record with scripture, the Bible. And so, Darwin comes along and kind of explodes that, and that whole period goes extinct in a certain sense. So that was the first chapter. The second chapter was again, genetic engineering and environment. Nature gets replaced by environment essentially during the 80s. The digital revolution, satellite photography, satellite communication. So that sort of post-Darwin era, in a way, gets eclipsed by another way of thinking about nature. And then, today, we're like, it's a difference in degree to a degree that's a difference in kind. Nature to us is really, this awareness that you can't escape nature. There was all this, before that there was a lot of effort in overcoming nature. We invent time zones so we're not dependent on the rising and setting of the sun and things like that. But, now we're kind of, I think there's this dawning awareness that, there's nowhere for us to go. We're going to have to find a way to live on this planet, on the planet's terms, not necessarily ours. And so that kind of helps fill the other watershed things. I did actually have a medieval chapter here, but I had to cut it. Medievals are very, they're super interesting. I want to think of nature as well. I guess where you all
I was thinking about the third chapter when you were reading about how much it resonates with the audience. And I was thinking about the experience of the audience. If, for example, this text was out there 2 years ago, right? I think one of the things that was kind of like making me aware of was that how much the experience of living through pandemic may resonate with the third chapter right now that we're reading it. And I was wondering, as an author, how did living like during the pandemic and writing the third chapter kind of like influence your writing or like challenge your writing? What was your experience?
Yeah, it was an incredible pain actually, because like I said, this was all written before that, you know, and then the pandemic hits, and suddenly everybody knows about things like viruses and all that, you know. So, and then the same thing with the bird feathers. You know. In a way, it's like you know, it's kind of unknown, and you know, as you're writing, you want to sort of bring the news to people, and now it's like yesterday's newspaper. It reminded me of pop culture, which I like swore I'd never write again, like about again, because it just changes so fast. But you know, as I've learned, so does the science. You know, the way they make viruses, vaccines is different than what they have in the book actually. The big company, you know, CRISPR invented. There's a lot of scientific and technical changes that happen over the course of 10 years of writing the book. And so, yeah, as I had at the last minute, I had to go back and rejig the parts to kind of take account of things like that. So, I don't know about science, I don't know about pop culture.
Yeah, I guess to do some speculative fiction, if you had to write like a fourth extinction sort of narrative, I guess like what would you predict that would look like based on what we have now?
How funny you should ask, but that's the zombie novel. It doesn't really. I think the thing that, you know, I think all those post-apocalyptic novels really get it wrong, you know, because I think, you know, we're going to limp through whatever happens, no matter how bad it gets. You know, who is it that said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism?
Jameson.
And I can't imagine the end of capitalism, you know, even if the world as we know it ends, you know, there's going to be Starbucks probably. And so this book I'm working on now is kind of tries to explore that idea where, you know, there's a lot of, you know, what I would do is go to Detroit, you know, Detroit ruins, and you see this, I mean, it's changed radically. It's, you know, I was back there a few years ago, just before the pandemic. I couldn't believe how much better it was, but just a few years before that, you know, they were like literally selling off the art museum and the zoo to keep a skeleton crew in the hospital going and things like that. You know, like I went to the art museum and people were parking on the stairs, you know, because there was no cop to write you a ticket or anything. Nobody was going to do it. They were only kind of pursuing murder cases and stuff like that. And so that kind of industrial, you know, the Midwest is a great place, you know. I grew up in Chicago, so that industrial ruins to me is like kind of a preview of what a quote-unquote apocalypse might look like. So it's a good landscape for a zombie.